Okay, hi John.
Hi, Fred. How are
Yeah,
you?
yeah, welcome back. We missed you.
Yeah, well, our when the wagon train leaves the south and heads north, it takes a
Right.
while. We're in Oklahoma. We'll be here all summer.
Oh, okay.
So, how was your week?
It was good. Excuse me just a minute.
Hey, John.
Hey, Chris, how are
Okay.
you?
I'm good.
Hey,
Ooh, now it says, it doesn't say
mhm,
Fred, it says CBI admin.
I
You have
know.
moved up in the world.
Yeah, this is an official recorded session where we've
Ooh,
moved up. Yeah.
I see
Wow,
that.
I was going to ask you, Fred, what prompted the change in the Zoom
Well, one of the
connection?
guys, it was Joel Shoncup. He said he couldn't make some of the Tuesdays, so we asked if we could record the things. And
Oh,
the trouble is, in order to record it, you have to have a host. And we've never really been hosting these meetings.
uh-huh.
Rabbi Marcos set it up originally, and he was the host. And when he left, he asked me, if I would keep it going.
Mhm.
But I never hosted it. We just all, clicked on the same link, and that was it. But then we found out you can't record it unless you have a host.
Right.
Oh,
So
okay.
who
So,
is Megan? Who is the woman that was helping us last week?
oh, Megan Chanel, she's a member of the congregation, and
Okay.
she actually knows something about tech. She set up the Beth Israel website.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So so from now on, yeah, I'll
Yeah.
be the host of the meeting.
Tell me to log in.
Okay. Hey, Harold.
Hey,
Okay.
I'm watching too.
Oh, okay.
This is Mindy.
Okay.
What are we discussing tonight?
We're still talking about the Roman era. So,
Oh,
if you're following in the outline, it's on page 7.
no,
Page
okay.
7. Okay.
Okay. But let's give everybody a few more minutes. It's not 5:30 yet, so we'll see if anybody else turns up.
Okay.
And here
Fred,
comes two more
can
people.
Yeah.
any of us go in now and watch a session if we missed one? How does that
You
work?
need them.
Well, this is the first one that we're actually recording.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But where does one, let's say we wanted to go back and watch it again. How would we get a link or like how could we watch it
Uh,
again?
I guess I could send it to you. I don't know. I have to
Oh,
ask Megan. She's, you have to remember, I'm a total tech idiot. Megan set this whole thing up. So she's,
I have a question. Can some of you who are high techies figure out a way that we don't have to enter all the information and can just join automatically?
Sue, I think if you just click the link that Megan sent us,
But
um,
it doesn't work.
it
oh,
worked for me. I just clicked it and I didn't have to enter any passwords or anything. Yours, that wasn't the case for you?
Nope.
no.
Hmm.
Well, you're here. You must have done something right.
You must be a
Well,
pretty tech.
I took the
Yeah.
information that she sent us and put it
Uh-huh.
in the boxes. And
Uh-huh.
so then I could, obviously, I'm here, so
You're here, so okay.
Ready to get rid of that.
Yeah,
Sue,
don't
yeah,
don't don't ask me for any explanations about
Well,
this. I
here's
don't
Megan, so
understand
so
You
it.
just
she
wear
can
in your
tell you.
bedroom or anything, you could use anything off it. It might. That's what I'm saying. It might.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
don't blame it on me. I'm the one who asked to record Fred.
Yeah.
This started this escapade, so I'm sorry.
Yeah. So
Well done, sir. Well done.
okay.
Hey, Fred,
Yeah.
it's Megan.
Oh,
Hey, yeah,
Megan, hi.
just making sure
Okay,
it's working. It looks like it is. So I'm going to step
it
away to the
is.
party. Okay.
Okay, well, hang on just a second. Anybody
Yeah.
who has any questions, ask Megan now.
Megan, the
Question.
link you sent me, I could not access. I had to put the name and the code in the boxes on Zoom in order to connect.
Could you copy and paste it to your address bar?
Yeah, I can put
Oh,
it.
yeah, I can, that I can do, but I
Oh,
can't.
that'll work.
Mhm.
That'll work.
Okay,
Yeah. But you're here.
Yeah.
Yay.
Megan,
Okay.
Yes,
how, if we wanted to watch a session again or watch a session we've missed, how can we go about doing that?
I'm gonna send, once you guys are done, I'm gonna send the class out to everyone in the group. So you'll have
Oh.
an ongoing record of the classes.
Oh, great. So then we
Great.
can go into that record and look.
Yep,
Oh, wonderful.
yeah, we'll have it for all posterity.
Yes. Fred deserves it.
Yeah.
He does.
Starting with this one. You know, the previous ones are not recorded, but starting with this one, we can do
No,
that.
Fred's gonna be a
Okay.
YouTube star.
Right. Yeah.
Think of all that
Okay.
yummy YouTube money. That'll be great.
Right. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll see y'all later. Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and start. If you're following on the outline, we're on page 7 of the outline, and we were talking about the Roman era in Jewish history. And last week we talked about how in the year 70, the first Jewish revolt against Rome failed. Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and an era in Jewish history really ended. And you think really at that point the Jews would have enough of rebelling. I mean, you know, it was a brutal end to the first rebellion, but it wasn't really over yet. In the year 117, the emperor was Trajan, and Trajan was basically a soldier, and one of his big ambitions was to invade Parthia. That's the name that the Romans gave to Persia. And this was an old Roman thing. Once in every generation, some ambitious Roman general would try to invade Parthia and add it, you know, and enlarge the empire to the east. And they always failed. And Trajan was determined to succeed. But he knew to get a big enough army, he would have to strip garrisons from all over the empire, which would leave the rest of the empire lightly defended. And he was also worried about Jewish revolts. There were rumors that Jews in various parts of the empire, you know, were ready to revolt. The other factor was that in Parthia, there was a very large Jewish community. You remember when we talked about the Babylonian exile, you know, when Cyrus of Persia gave them permission to go back, most of them didn't. And the majority of the exiles stayed there in Babylon, which became part of Persia or Parthia. And by this time, that community had grown to almost 1 million people. So there was a sizable Jewish community in Parthia, and Trajan wanted them at least not to be fighting against him, even if they weren't on his side. So what he did before he left in his campaign, he actually visited Jerusalem, met with the Sanhedrin, and promised them when he came back victorious from Parthia, he would rebuild the temple. And he was hoping this would kind of keep the Jews quiet while he was busy campaigning in Parthia, but it didn't. You know, while he was there, revolts broke out in Egypt, in Cyprus, and in what the Romans call Cyrenaica, which is what we call Libya today in North Africa. And these all had to be put down. And in the end, Trajan failed. Like every other Roman general, he was defeated, but also came back with a fever that he had caught, probably malaria, and died soon after he returned. The throne then went to his cousin, who was Hadrian. And Hadrian really, in the estimation of most historians, was one of the great Roman emperors, maybe even the best. He was a highly educated man who took the job really very seriously. He really considered himself a servant of the empire. He made frequent trips all through the empire, visiting every province, seeing how things were going, building things, checking out how the government was functioning. And Hadrian actually visited Judea, met again with the Sanhedrin, and told them that he would keep Trajan's promise. He would go ahead and was going to rebuild the temple. It was just going to be a couple of changes, though. It was going to be a temple to Jupiter, and also the city, rather than being called Jerusalem, would be called Aelia Capitolina. Aeolus was Hadrian's family name, so it was literally Hadrian's capital would be the new name of the city. And to Hadrian, you know, this was no big thing. To him, he was doing the Jews a favor they didn't deserve. They'd staged this long revolt. It had cost the empire a lot of money, a lot of casualties, And here, in spite of that, he was going to rebuild their capital city and rebuild the temple. And he couldn't understand why the Jews reacted so violently to that. There's a movie you may have seen years ago. It was a Paul Newman movie called Cool Hand Luke. And if you saw Cool Hand Luke, one of the classic lines in that movie is that what we have here is a failure to communicate. And this was a perfect example of that. Hadrian was really a highly educated pagan, and he really just couldn't understand the Jews. I mean, the Romans had a whole pantheon of gods. If they conquered another people and liked the god they were worshiping, they would add to the pantheon. To a pagan, the world was full of gods, and you could switch from one to another. You could add or subtract gods from your pantheon, and he could never understand why these fanatic Jews, couldn't be budged from this position of this one invisible God that they claimed to be worshiping, and they wouldn't accept any other gods. The Romans worshiped at least a dozen gods. Why couldn't the Jews worship at least two, maybe three? So, from his point of view, the Jewish response was totally incomprehensible. He couldn't understand these people. From the Jewish side, to them, Hadrian was deliberately insulting them. To say we're going to rebuild your temple, but it's a temple to Jupiter. That was just a deliberate slap in the face. As far as the Jews were concerned, he was mocking them. And that led to the final revolt against Rome. And this began in the year 132. And in the first revolt against Rome, the one that began in 67, the various zealot groups were as busy fighting each other as they were fighting the Romans. This time, the Jews were united, though. There was a very charismatic military leader who arose called Shimon ben Koziba. And in fact, one of the most prominent rabbis of the 2nd century, Rabbi Akiba, actually decided that Bar Koziba was the Messiah and announced that to everybody who would listen. And he was one of the most prestigious rabbis of his age, and people listened. That Bar Koziba was acclaimed as the Messiah. In fact, Rabbi Akiba even changed his name to Bar Kokhba, and which means son of a star. There's a prophecy back in the book of Numbers that a star shall shoot forth from Jesse. And as far as Rabbi Akiba was concerned, Shimon Bar Kokhba was going to be the guy who was going to finally defeat the Romans and give Judea its independence. And actually, Bar Kokhba turned out to be a pretty formidable military leader. The Romans were driven out of Judea for a while, and for at least a couple of years, Judea was independent again. The archaeologists in Israel have actually found coins with Bar Kokhba's image on one side and either year one of our freedom or year two of our freedom on the other side. So at least for a couple of years, Judea was independent, issuing its own coins. But again, in the end, it failed. The Romans finally overcame it. The final battle was a place called Beitar, which is a little bit south of Jerusalem. And in the end, Beitar fell. Bar Kokhba was killed, and the rebellion was over. But this time Hadrian was really mad. I mean, first of all, his offer of rebuilding the temple had been slapped down by the Jews, and then they rose up in another expensive, bloody revolt. And he finally decided the only way to stop these revolts was to have no more Judaism. And Chris, you mentioned this last week. Why didn't the Romans just get rid of the Jews? And Hadrian actually made the effort. The first thing he did was to rename the country. He didn't want to see the word Judea on any more Roman maps. So what he decided to do is to rename it Syria Palestina. And the word Palestina really comes from the time when the Philistines were there, from the biblical era in Judaism. The Philistines lived on the coast, and what now is approximately Gaza on a modern map. And in Hebrew, it was called Peleshet, the land of the Philistines. When the Greeks took over the Middle East, they Hellenized Peleshet to Philistia. When the Romans took over, they changed Philistia to Palestina. And of course, it wasn't until the 20th century when the British took over that they anglicized Palestina to Palestine. But what Hadrian decided to call it was Syria Palestina, essentially the Philistine part of Syria. Even though the biblical Philistines were long gone by that time, in a sense, he was verbally giving the country back to the Indians, essentially. Just another way to humiliate the Jews, since it would no longer be called Judea. And then he decided to make it a capital crime to publicly teach or practice Judaism. And this was a real problem for the rabbis. The Sanhedrin actually had a meeting at a city called Lud and debated about what to do. They knew the Romans were dead serious about this. Anybody who publicly taught or practiced Judaism would be executed. And but again, the Torah was not a suicide pact. There had to be some way where they could get through this. And so they finally came to a decision, but actually had a lot of resonance in Jewish history. They decided that there were three basic values in Judaism that couldn't be given up. You had to be willing to suffer a martyr's death before you gave them up. And the three things were the unity of God, the sanctity of human life, and the sanctity of marriage and the family. So you could not kill, you could not practice idolatry, you could not practice incest or adultery. Those things you had to be willing to die before you would do. Everything else could be put on hold, till things got better. You could not publicly, you didn't have to publicly teach Torah. You didn't have to have open services in public. You could do whatever you needed to do as long as you held to those three things. In fact, what's really amazing that people were still willing to follow Rabbi Akiba, after the disaster that he had led the country to. We proclaimed Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. But I think even a sage can have an off day. So apparently Akiba was forgiven for that. And what was interesting is he and several other rabbis decided that for themselves they would continue to publicly teach in defiance of the Roman edict. And Akiba and 9 other rabbis eventually were executed by the Romans for continuing to defy Hadrian's edict. And that's been commemorated in the afternoon service on Yom Kippur. We read the Martyrology. It's part of the Yom Kippur Siddur, and the Martyrology essentially commemorates those rabbis, who still defied Hadrian and decided to teach publicly. The thing is, though, looking at it as it worked out historically, it was really a case of bad timing because, Hadrian's edicts went into effect in 135, but he died 3 years later in 138. And his successor, Antoninus Pius, revoked most of his anti-Jewish edicts. So if those rabbis had just held on for a little bit, they wouldn't have had to be martyrs. The laws were only in effect for 3 years. But it made really a permanent change in Jewish history. For one thing, now for the first time, there were more Jews living in diaspora than there were living in Judea. Everyone who was not killed by the Romans in the course of all these rebellions, most of the women and children were sold into slavery all over the empire. And so for the first time, there were more Jews in diaspora than there were living in the land of Israel. And it also led to really the major Jewish cultural achievement that came out of the ancient world, which was the Talmud. Toward the end of the 2nd century, the rabbis decided it was time to write down all of the rabbinic commentary on the Torah. This had never been done before. There was actually a tradition that rabbinic commentary should not be written down. And we're not really sure why this was so. There's one theory that said that scripture should be held on a higher level. The scripture was sacred, and even though rabbinic commentary was important, it was not on the same level as the Torah itself. And so it should be kept as an oral tradition rather than writing it down. The problem was by the end of the 2nd century, there were really 2 problems. One is that every generation of rabbis added more stuff to it. And so eventually it just got to be too much for anybody to carry around in their head. There was just too much for anybody to memorize, and it really had to be written down. The other reason was that the Jewish people were now scattered in a diaspora, which was going to really last for the next 18 centuries till modern Zionism. And there would be many Jews living in places that had no rabbi. And how were they supposed to know what the law was? And so work began toward the end of the 2nd century on what was called the Mishnah, which was really the writing down of the oral rabbinic tradition. The Mishnah, the name they gave it is interesting because Mishnah comes from the verb shana, which means to repeat. And so Mishnah really means the repetition. So what the rabbis were really saying was, we're not making up anything new. We're just repeating the Torah, but we're elaborating on it more. We're giving you more detail, which is really not true. The rabbis made up all kinds of stuff. But the idea was that, that nothing new here. This is just the Torah, but we're just elaborating on it in more detail. And when you think about it, our own Supreme Court does the same thing. Whenever the Supreme Court hands down a ruling, especially if it's on some hot topic, like abortion or gay marriage or something that really gets people, excited. The people that like it always say, well, this just shows that they're making the Constitution a living document. They're interpreting it, for the needs of the present age. The people that don't like it say that's not in the Constitution. They're just making it up and they're legislating from the bench. And this really was the criticism that the rabbis got initially from the Sadducees. The Sadducees believed the only law was the literal Torah, and the priests were the only ones who could interpret it. And the Bible didn't say anything about rabbis or synagogues, and therefore the rabbis had no right to make up any rules. Of course, and it was really the Romans that decided that. Once the temple was destroyed and the priests were unemployed, the Sadducee party essentially collapsed. It faded out of history. And it was the rabbis who were left to fashion Judaism the way they wanted to. And basically, they were doing the same thing that modern lawyers really do. If you look at the basic document that governs our country, it's the Constitution. And the Constitution is really a fairly short document. You can get a copy that'll fit in your shirt pocket. But if you walk into a lawyer's office, there are all these rows of books. And this is basically case law. And the reason that you need all this case law is the Constitution itself is full of a lot of very general concepts, which really can't be exactly defined, except as a judge defines it in a specific case. Our Constitution is full of all sorts of great phrases like due process, no establishment of religion, no unreasonable searches or seizures, and no cruel or unusual punishments, which are all great things. We all agree with that, but they're not really defined. What makes a punishment cruel or unusual? What makes a search unreasonable rather than reasonable? What does due process actually mean in a specific situation? All these things have to be defined by the courts. And in the same way, the Torah says all sorts of things, like love your neighbor as yourself. Nobody would disagree with that, but what does it actually mean? I mean, you obviously can't love all 7.5 billion people in the world, the way you love your own family. And what are your obligations to other people? Does it mean that you have to pay your neighbor's kids' college tuition? What if you don't love yourself very much? What does that mean the way you treat other people? Somebody has to actually work out actual rules for what you do in specific situations. It's not enough just to say, love your neighbor, and that's all you need. And so the rabbis created the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is a very long, elaborate explanation of what the rabbis thought that the Torah basically means. And sometimes they really went kind of far out. How do you get from a verse in the Torah that says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, and end up with two separate sets of dishes? Sometimes the rabbis really just took something and ran with it way beyond, what the Torah actually said. In fact, you may have heard Rabbi Marco tell this story. It's one of his favorite stories. Moses is up on Mount Sinai, for 40 days and 40 nights getting the law from God. And God says, Moses, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, you mean we shouldn't eat any meat dish with any milk dish? God says, no, Moses, What I said was, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, I understand now. You want us to have two separate sets of dishes for milk and for meat dishes. No, Moses, what I said was, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, I understand. Now I got it. You don't want us to eat any kind of meat dish for at least 4 hours after any milk dish. Never mind, do what you want. And again, a lot of the things the Jews live by are not really literally in the Torah. They're really in the rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, rabbi-made rules. And the fact that Jews were willing to follow these rules and still follow them in Orthodox communities really show how much prestige these rabbis have or had at that time. You know, how much respect that the people held them in, that they were willing to follow these rabbi-made rules, which really were very, very tenuously connected to the Torah sometimes. But the Mishnah became the core of what later was going to be called the Talmud. And basically, the Mishnah was really the very last thing that Jews produced in Judea. The shift at this point, the center of Jewish culture shifted back to Babylonia, which was part of Parthia, part of the Persian Empire, which is really one of the ironies of history. You know, when the Babylonian exile was over and Cyrus allowed the Jews to go back, you know, and only a minority of them went back. And they were probably cursing the ones that stayed, you know, the ones that didn't come back to help them rebuild Judea. But it turned out really to be a good thing in the long run. Because as I said, this community had grown to almost 1 million people by the 2nd century. And it was the only Jewish community in the world that was outside the reach of Rome. So that while all this revolution and chaos were going on in Judea during the first 2 centuries of this era, the Babylonian Jewish community continued to thrive and grow. And when a Jewish life in Judea had pretty much been crushed, the center of gravity of Jewish culture shifted back over to Babylonia. And it was really the Babylonian academy that took the Mishnah and created the Talmud. Basically, the rabbis of Babylonia took the Mishnah and spent about 4 centuries arguing about what the Mishnah meant. And what they came up with was called the Gemara. And Gemara just comes from the Hebrew verb gamar, which means to finish something. And to them, the Gemara was the finishing touches they were putting on the Mishnah. So basically, and the Gemara and Mishnah and Gemara together are the core of the Talmud. The Mishnah is basically a 4 century long argument about what the Torah means, and the Gemara is a 4 century long argument about what the Mishnah means. But by around the 6th or 7th century, the basic core of the Talmud had basically been completed. It really wasn't the end. I mean, there were medieval commentators on the Talmud that added more stuff. The greatest of all the biblical commentators, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, who we call Rashi, who was a French rabbi from the 11th century, added his own commentary on the entire Mishnah and Gemara, which became part of the Talmud. And finally, you know, they had to send it to the printer. And in the 16th century, you know, it was the first printed edition of the Talmud came out, with the Mishnah, the Gemara, Rashi's commentary, the other medieval commentaries. And this is what makes up what we call the Talmud today. There are actually two Talmuds. The rabbis who were still left in Israel created their own, but it was much smaller than the Babylonian Talmud, and really is not studied nearly as much. Usually, when people talk about the Talmud, they're talking about the Babylonian Talmud, what's called the Talmud Bavli, the ones that was created in Babylonia. And actually, the Talmudic academies in Babylonia really were the religious center of the Jewish world up until about the year 1000, up until around the 11th century. You know, by the 11th century, there had been a golden age in Spain, and the Spanish Jews developed their own academies of learning. The great medieval philosopher Maimonides had set up his own center of learning in Egypt. And by about 1000 the Babylonian academies were no longer the center of Jewish authority and learning. But until then, they really were. They were the one place in the world where Jews all through the diaspora looked for guidance. You know, if a community somewhere, let's say in Spain or in Gaul or in Greece or anywhere, had a religious question to ask, they would send the question to Babylonia. Usually, it was given to a merchant who was traveling east and who would carry it for them. And since sending a letter was really a big deal in those days, they would usually give a description of the community, how many people were there, what the relations were with the non-Jewish community, you know, what the problems within the Jewish community were, in addition to the religious questions they were asking. And those letters are really one of the best sources we have for the history of Jews during that period, during the early Middle Ages, into the later Middle Ages. And then the rabbis at the Talmudic academies would get the letter, and then they would debate this for a while and finally come up with a response, what's called a rabbinic responsa. And then this would be carried back to that particular community. And some of these responsa really were major landmarks in the development of Judaism. For instance, in the 10th century, the Jewish community of Barcelona was having a dispute over what the proper order of the prayers were, you know, to be recited. And so they sent a question to the rabbis in Babylonia. And in those days, there were no prayer books. You know, even from the earliest days from the Roman period, nobody had thought to put the prayers together in a book. Either you knew the prayers by heart or you didn't. And so the people who were, in fact, there's a custom which we still see in some Orthodox synagogues. You know, when the Amida, which is the central prayer of every synagogue service, is recited, and we don't do it anymore in conservative and Reform Judaism, but in an Orthodox synagogue, the Amida is actually done twice. First, the entire congregation rises and reads the Amida silently, you know, the way it was originally meant to be done. But then the cantor or whoever's leading the service does the Amida again. It's called the reader's repetition of the Amida. And you know, you ask, why do you have to do the same prayer twice? Well, it originated in an era when there were no prayer books, and a lot of the congregation didn't know the Amida. They couldn't recite it from memory. So in the first phase, the silent Amida, those people who knew it would recite it silently to themselves. And then the rabbi or cantor would do it out loud so that the people who didn't know the Amida could at least hear it read. And that custom is, what we do actually is kind of a hybrid kind of thing. You know, Beth Israel, we recite the first 3 pages of the Amida. You know, the rabbi leads it, we all sing along, and then we do the rest of it silently. So we have kind of a hybrid form. And the only time that we do the old-fashioned way is if you come to high holiday services, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we do a silent Amida, and then the cantor, you know, does the Amida. So we keep it up that way, even though there really is no reason for it anymore. Now that everybody has a prayer book, but the tradition, you know, nobody wants to drop the tradition so that it goes on. But what the rabbis in Babylonia did in the 10th century, they finally decided what the proper order of the prayers was for the weekday service and for the Sabbath service. And they wrote it all down and sent it back in a responsa, which they call Sidur HaTefillot, which is the arrangement of the prayers. And it became so popular that other communities began copying this responsa. And ever since then, the traditional name for a Jewish prayer book is the Sidur, from the name of that responsa. But and the Talmud really probably is the most important thing that Judaism, other than the Torah itself, or the Bible itself, is probably the most important thing that the Jewish culture produced. Because really, you know, if you look at the way a modern observant Orthodox Jew lives, he's not really living by the of a literal Torah. He's really living according to the Talmud. Almost everything that we do is really Talmudic law, really not Torah law, even though it's based on the Torah. A good example, really, is that we all cover our heads when we go into a synagogue. Well, there's not a word about that anywhere in the Torah about covering your head, or anywhere in the whole Bible for that matter. This is something that the rabbis of the Talmud came up with. When we went in the morning services, we put on a talit, with fringes on it. Well, again, the Bible does say you should wear fringes, but it says you should put fringes on the corners of your clothes and not wear a prayer shawl. There's nothing about prayer shawls, in the Torah. But this was an adaptation that the rabbis allowed. It's okay to wear the fringes, not on your clothes, but on a special garment, a talit, which is designed just for the purpose. And there are any number of things. For instance, most of the laws of kashrut are really made by the rabbis, not by the Torah. I mean, the Torah actually tells you which animals you can eat and which animals you can't. But most of the laws that the Jews follow in kashrut, like separating milk and meat, which is not really in the Torah literally, it's a rabbinic kind of invention, and the kind of meat you can eat. I mean, the Torah tells you which animals are okay and which are not. But for instance, take an animal like a deer. Most Jews don't realize a deer is really a kosher animal. It has a cloven hoof and it's a ruminant. There's no reason why you can't eat venison, but you'll practically never see venison, in a kosher home. And the reason is the rules the rabbis made up. Even though a deer, has a cloven hoof and is a ruminant, it's not kosher unless it's slaughtered in the proper manner. So you can't go deer hunting and shoot the deer and then bring it back and eat it. The deer has to be slaughtered in the proper manner. And the only way to do that, you'd have to raise the deer as a domestic animal, and then kill it. And nobody wants to kill Bambi, so that doesn't really work. Or you'd have to actually go out and somehow trap the deer and bring it back in so you could slaughter it, the proper way. And so as a result of that, most people are not willing to do that. And as a result of that, venison rarely gets eaten in a kosher home, even though it's theoretically, a kosher meat. And again, most of the other things what Jews do is really a result of rabbinic decisions in the Talmud, and not really a literal reading of the Torah. And the Talmud itself is really it's a difficult thing to approach, because you have to get into a rabbinic frame of mind, which is kind of difficult. For instance, the very first tractate of the Talmud is called Barachot, blessings, and it's really just a collection of all the various blessings and when they should be, and prayers and when they should be said, on what occasions. And the very first thing it starts off with is, when should the Shema be said? Well, this would seem to be pretty easy. You just look at the Torah, Book of Exodus. When you lie down and when you rise up. That's pretty simple. So just say the blessing, say the Shema before you go to bed at night, and say the Shema again when you get up in the morning. That's an easy question, and it's settled. But it's not settled, because another rabbi comes in and says, "Yeah, but how early in the morning can you say the Shema and it's okay? And how late can you say it and it's still the Shema?" And the same thing with the evening Shema. How early in the evening can you say the Shema? And how late, when is it too late to say the Shema? Now, most people at this point would say, who cares? Why should it matter to you or God or anybody else whether you say your morning prayers at 6:30 or 8:15? Why would anybody want to argue about something like this? Well, again, you have to understand the rabbinic frame of mind. To them, study and argument was as holy a thing as prayer. And so even though a lot of the stuff seems to us to be really just nitty-gritty nonsense, stuff that nobody really has to argue about, the rabbis didn't look at it that way. They thought anything that has to do with God and his commandments is worth arguing about, even the tiniest details of it. So they didn't see this really as being anything too far at all. In fact, actually, they considered study to be so sacred that they actually wrote a prayer to be said after you study a text. And the prayer actually is the most popular prayer, really, one of the most popular, in the entire Jewish Siddur, which is the Kaddish. The Kaddish was originally written to be recited after you studied the text. Most Jews don't realize that. It's usually associated now with the mourner's Kaddish, which is one form of the Kaddish. But that really didn't come up till around the 14th century. Originally, the Kaddish was really meant as a scholar's prayer to be recited after you studied the text. And actually, one of the forms, if you look in the Siddur, one of the forms of the Kaddish, which we don't usually recite, but Orthodox congregations do, is called the Scholar's Kaddish, the Kaddish de Rabbanan, which was really written specifically, when scholars studied a text. So to them, there's nothing too small or too detailed to be studied. Anything that has to do with God's law is worth arguing about really ad infinitum. And again, you don't have to stay on the subject. It's okay to go off on tangents. For instance, the discussion that goes on about when to recite the Shema, one rabbi says, well, maybe we should go by the watches of the night. And, there's a biblical concept. The night was divided up into 3 watches, 8 to 12, 12 to 4, 4 to 8. And maybe we should go by, you can only recite the Shema after the last watch of the night, after 8 a.m. But that reminds another rabbi about a story about King David. What we call midrash, stories the rabbis made up about events in the Bible. And there was a midrash about King David being up through all 3 watches of the night, preparing for a major battle the next day. And that reminds another rabbi about another story about King David. And so for the next couple of pages, they just go off on a tangent, swapping anecdotes about King David. And then they finally get back on the main topic again. When can the Shema be said? Well, it can be said any time from dawn until noon, finally. But then another rabbi asks, but when is dawn? When you first see the horizon getting to be a little bit lighter, and the sun's getting ready to come up, or is dawn only when the sun is completely up, when you can see the entire sun above the horizon? You have to remember there were no clocks at this time, so you had to go by the sun. And they argue about that for a while. And then the other argument is, well, you can say the evening Shema as soon as the evening starts. And you can't say it after dark. Okay, well, when does the evening start? When it starts to get cool in the afternoon, when the sun is really almost at the horizon? Or does it start when the sun touches the horizon? Or do you have to wait till the sun is still entirely down? You can't see the sun at all. And they finally decided that when you can see 3 stars in the sky, then it's officially evening. And then it's too late to say the Shema. And they go on, it takes about 15 pages to get to this thing. And say, okay, you say, okay, that's fine. So basically what they're saying is you can pretty much say it anytime you want to. You can say it from the time that it first becomes barely light in the morning until noon, and you can say it from late afternoon till it's definitely dark at night. And basically, the rabbis did this really because, again, they felt that studying was really a sacred kind of thing. You couldn't do too much of it. And so basically, it didn't matter how small the subject was or how long you went on arguing about it. But the real problem is, what if you're an ordinary Jew living in a place where there are no rabbis or there are no Talmud scholars, and you just want a simple answer to a simple question? Is this thing permitted or not permitted on the Sabbath? Is food prepared this way kosher or not? Well, what do? Do you really want to have to wade through 20 or 30 pages of rabbinic argument, in order to get the answer? And again, the Talmud is not that easy to read, even if you know Hebrew, because a lot of it is not in Hebrew. The Mishnah was written in Hebrew, but when the Babylonian rabbis wrote the Gemara in Babylon at that time, the language is Aramaic. So the Talmud then is a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic. And so you can't read it unless you also know Aramaic. So only a very few people are really able to read it in the first place. And then it has no table of contents, and it has no index. So essentially, you sort of have to know the whole thing to know any of it. And it wasn't really till around the 14th or 15th century that people started writing law codes, where you would basically take a subject and and just give the conclusion the rabbis came to about it, without all the arguing and all the anecdotes and all the other stuff that go along with it. But until then, only people who basically devoted most of their life to studying the Talmud were really able to know what it said. And so if you had a religious question, you had to go to your rabbi, because he was the only one who could really give you the answer to that. And it was not till much, much later that there were law codes that you could consult, which would give you the answer to a specific question. Um, I've been talking nonstop all this time. Anybody have any comments or any questions at this point? Yeah, I notice a lot of you are muted. Go ahead and unmute.
No, I do have a question. This goes back to what you were talking about, hunting deer and all and that kind of thing, how it's not kosher. But weren't there hunters in Torah? Like, I mean, aren't there stories about being, I'm trying to remember which one it was, how he would go out into the field and bring meat back to him. So how was that okay then, but not okay now? Was it before Torah was given and the rule wasn't there?
Yeah,
Fill me
and
in.
before the rabbis made all these rules, yeah. Well, we really don't know how biblical Jews lived. The rabbis will tell you, well, biblical Jews lived according to Torah. Yeah, but they didn't have the rabbi to tell them what the Torah meant. And if you only, let's say you decide to keep kosher, but you don't believe, but you're a Sadducee essentially. You believe you'll follow what's in the Torah literally and nothing else. You're not going to follow all these rabbinic rules. Well, obviously, there are animals that you won't eat and animals that you will, but a lot of kosher stuff today you don't need to do. For instance, after Noah's flood, as part of the covenant, the God gives people a permission to eat meat for the first time. He says, if you have to eat meat, go ahead and eat meat, but don't eat the blood. Well, what does eating blood mean? Nobody really knows. The rabbis decided that every drop of blood you could had to be gotten out of the meat before it was kosher. So now you have this long soaking and salting thing, that you have to go through, in order for meat to be kosher. But that's not really in the Torah. It just says don't eat blood. So,
It's because
and
God was against blood pudding, because blood pudding is gross and nobody should eat it.
yeah. Well, I used to think who would eat blood, and then I saw a Natural Geographic special, and actually there are tribes in Africa like the Maasai, who are nomads driving herds, and what they'll do is take a hollow reed and bevel it, and they'll cannulate the jugular vein of their animal, roll off the blood, mix it with milk, and that's a basic part of their diet. It's a very high protein, very nourishing drink, actually, blood mixed with milk. So apparently in the biblical era, there were people who were literally eating blood. But now, this soaking and salting thing, that's a totally rabbinic invention. That's not really in the Torah. In fact, the rabbis didn't know it, but they were inventing kosher salt. Most people who, see kosher salt in a supermarket, they figure this salt is kosher, but most other salt is not. There's nothing kosher about the salt. Salt can't be not kosher. It's not a food, it's a mineral. What kosher salt really means is koshering salt. It's the salt that you sprinkle on meat, to make in the process of making it kosher. And the only difference between kosher salt and regular salt, that kosher salt comes in these big flakes instead of the tiny grains that we typically use in a salt shaker. And the reason for that is if you're koshering a piece of meat, and you want to make sure that you've totally covered it with salt. If you use regular salt in the salt shaker, it just disappears into the meat and you're not sure what you've done. If you use these big flakes of salt, then you've covered the meat. And so that's why it got called, it's really koshering salt, but it eventually ended up being called kosher salt. And as it turns out, a lot of chefs like to use it for different reasons. So kosher salt became a big deal, and a lot of non-Jewish recipes, really. But that's really where it came from. And the other thing that makes kosher meat so expensive is nothing in the Torah. It's based on an incident in the Torah. When Jacob is going to meet his brother Esau the next day, and the night before he wrestles with an angel, and somehow the angel reaches into the hollow of his thigh and damages his thigh somehow. and Jacob limps after that. And so the text says that we do not eat the sinew of the thigh. Now, nobody really knows what the sinew of the thigh means. Hebrew is really short on anatomic terms. The Hebrew is gedi yerech. Gedi is translated as sinew, but sinew doesn't mean anything in modern anatomy. In the modern anatomy class, nobody talks about sinews. And biblical Hebrew doesn't have any words for artery, for vein, for nerve, for tendon, for ligament, for muscle. So we don't really know what gedi means. And yerech is a really vague anatomic term. It can mean the thigh, it can mean the hip, it can mean the genitalia, for which Hebrew has no names. It can mean the flank, the area over the kidney. It can mean the side. And so gedi yerech is hopefully vague, hopelessly vague. Nobody knows exactly what it means, but the rabbis decided it was the sciatic nerve, which really had consequences because the sciatic nerve comes out of a lower spine, the lumbar spine. It runs down through deep in the buttocks and then runs down the back of the leg. If you've ever had sciatica, you know exactly where it runs. But it's almost impossible to injure the sciatic nerve with wrestling or with trauma to the hip. Because it's really buried deep down in layers of fat and muscle in the buttocks and leg. The only reason people get sciatica is, damage to the lower back where the nerve is exposed. But for some weird reason, the rabbis decided that gedi yerech means the sciatic nerve. And the problem is to actually extract the sciatic nerve from the hindquarter of an animal without totally messing up all the meat and making it useless, shredding up the meat in the process of doing it is very, very difficult. It's really high-class surgery, really. A lot of kosher slaughterhouses don't have anybody with the skill or experience to do it properly. And so what they end up doing is throwing away the hindquarters of the animal and using only cuts from the front of the animal, which is a really very, very wasteful. And it's the reason why kosher meat really costs so much. It's because of rabbinic rules, not because of what the Torah says. There are plenty of structures around the hip that are very easy to remove. And if a rabbi had decided that gedi yerech means, say, the femoral nerve or the femoral artery, that's really easy to remove and no problem at all. But they made the one choice that really makes it difficult and expensive to prepare kosher meat. One theory is that the reasoning was we were never meant to eat meat in the first place anyway. It was only granted after Noah's flood as kind of a concession to human weakness. So what the rabbis were saying is, okay, you want to eat meat. If you have to eat meat, you can eat meat. We're going to make you jump through all kind of hoops to do it. We're not going to make it easy. So, anybody else? Yeah.
Fred, the use of salt going back in time also has been to preserve the meat or the fish or whatever.
It is.
I guess any kind of living organism, the salt somehow preserves it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so meat would have been salted in a lot of cases anyway if you wanted to preserve it. Fresh meat wouldn't have been, but anything else would be. Yeah. In fact, it's interesting. A lot of kosher houses really ruin meat because they assume that if there's any red left in the meat at all, it must be traces of blood, and so they basically cook the meat way past well done. Till it's all totally brown all the way through. So they figure it's not kosher unless you do that. What they don't realize is that even if you drain all the blood out of fresh meat, it's still going to be red because you have myoglobin in the muscles, which gives it a red color, even if there's no hemoglobin, left from the blood. But a lot of meat gets ruined because people think that you have to, make it totally brown, or else it's not really kosher.
Fred, I have a question.
Yes.
This may have been already spoken of in previous lectures or coming up, but my understanding is there was a period in time where the non-Jewish leaders told the Jews that they couldn't teach or study Torah. So that's why we do the Haftorah. What period of time was that? Because That was a,
No, no, you're right. That's one explanation for why we do the Haftorah after the Torah reading and services. The idea was that you could no longer read the Torah publicly. This was under Hadrian, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion was crushed, and Hadrian made all these anti-Jewish laws. So the idea was you'd get around that instead of reading the Torah portion, you'd read a portion from the prophets that would remind you of the Torah portion that you couldn't read. At least that's the theory people have about why the Haftorah got to be part of the synagogue liturgy.
so it was during this Hadrian time period, if,
Do you think? There's actually another theory about that. There's always more than one theory about everything in Judaism, but there's another theory that it goes back to the time of the Maccabees. When the Greeks tried to stamp out Jewish practice, and the Greeks, made those kind of rules, and so it was to get around that. It could be either one.
thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments anybody has? Yeah. Well, one of the things that happened at this point is that there really is no history of Judaism after this point as a single history. Up until this point, up until the dispersion after the last revolt against Rome, there was always a Jewish diaspora. There were always some Jews living outside of Israel, but most of the Jews were always living in Israel. And so they really had a single history. But after this point, there really is no single Jewish history anymore. Different Jews in different parts of the world developed their own cultures and really in their own history. So from this point on, you really have to take Jewish histories, plural, one at a time, because there are different Jewish cultures that developed in different parts of the world. So basically, starting next week, we'll start with the Sephardic Jews, the Jews of Spain, who have their own culture and their own history. And so if you're looking in the outline, we'll start with page 9 next week with the Sephardim. And again, if you look at the suggested reading list, if you look at number 8 on the list, I think one of the more readable books about it is a book by Jane Gerber called The Jews of Spain. It's number 8 on the reading list if you want to read over that before. Okay. So any other questions or comments?
Very good, Fred.
Well, okay.
Thanks so
Awesome.
much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Where is
Okay,
the,
see you all. See
See
you
you
all
all next week.
Yeah.
See you, gang.
Fred, where is
Okay.
the reading list?
Enjoy it, Fred.
Okay. Good.
Fred, where is the reading list?
It's with the syllabus. It should be there with the syllabus.
Oh, I
Did
see.
you didn't get it?
No, I have the syllabus. I turned it over. It's on the second page, I think. I got it. It's
It
right,
should be on the first or second page of the syllabus.
it's the second page, right after.
Okay. Got it? Okay.
Thank you. All right, Fred.